All right, welcome to the first class of advanced linguistic structure. In this lecture, we're just going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the basics that you will need to know for the rest of the course. You might be familiar with some of these concepts, but we will cover them anyway to make sure that we're all on the same footing. We have the same foundation. Okay, so we're going to define linguistic structure in this way, and this is the one that was given in the syllabus, and I think it's a pretty good linguistic structure, definition of linguistic structure. It is that linguistic structure is the observable patterns and organizational principles in any single language. Now, it's true that every single language has structure. Every single one has these patterns that we can observe and talk about. Every single one has principles that allow words or phrases or clauses or even sounds, morphemes, to be organized in principled ways. And this is what we're going to study in an advanced way. We're going to figure out how this structure applies to other areas outside of linguistics, or outside of theory, to more real-world problems like forensic linguistics and historical change and things like that. So, since we know what linguistic structure is, it's a good idea to also have a clean understanding of these next three terms. The first one is linguistics, and ask yourself, what is linguistics? And the next one, empirical or descriptive linguistics. Ask yourself, what do you think that means? Do a Google search, figure out what these words mean, and then try to figure out the definition. And the same thing with theoretical linguistics. The distinction is really important as we study structure, because some people will talk about language structures. If you review literature or see analyses, and they'll be describing their analyses or talking about their analyses in a perspective that may not be the same as your perspective. So you really need to understand the difference between empirical and theoretical linguistics. In general, we're going to say that linguistics is the systematic and scientific study of language, and that we're interested in getting to this language through the perspective of each individual language. So we look at one individual language, and from that try to generalize and abstract to what is true for language in general, or all languages. Empirical linguistics is about describing things, so making observations and generalizing from those observations what you've seen. Sometimes you don't even have to generalize. Descriptive linguistics can also be about just describing what you see, being really good at observing linguistic phenomena. Theoretical linguistics is to make the observations to test a hypothesis, to see if you could model the way language works, or to test or refine an already existing model of language. These distinctions are really important, like I said, and we'll talk about them as we go throughout this course to see how they interact and how they affect the way we do linguistics. Here are three utterances. One of them I made up. One of them I found in the corpus of contemporary American English, and the other one I heard around me. And we want to talk about these in terms of both descriptive and theoretical linguistics. We'll try to study them for a second. So in the first one, I talked to the man with the telescope for hours. If we sit back and we try to make some observations about this, we describe what's going on. We might be able to say that the sentence is relatively long. We can talk about that there are nouns and verbs. We can also talk about meaning. In this sentence, there's at least two meanings. Either the man has the telescope or I do. And those all are observations we can make. Now, one step further in the empirical descriptive tradition would be to say, okay, from those observations that we're making, what can we generalize about the language? We can generalize things like all languages have nouns and verbs, or ambiguity is an essential part of language, or structural organization is an essential part of language. From the descriptive standpoint, or from the theoretical standpoint, we need to start with an assumption. We need to start with a model. Our goal is to build a model of language. So we could say something like, in the way we know about language, we believe it's like every other language in the world, and every other language in the world seems to have constituents, groups of words that function as a unit. And if we were to test in this sentence, we could look at this and test for that hypothesis. We wouldn't be making, all the other observations we could make would be irrelevant. We're only focusing now on constituency. And this is the point of theoretical linguistics. You constrain it down to test for a single idea, for a single model. If we do the same thing with the next sentence, every time we talked about bad fish, everybody kind of went nuts on us. We can make another set of observations empirically. There are verbs in this one, there are prepositions, longer sentences, there's tense, there's habit being talked about. There's a number of things we can observe, and we can generalize from these about language. From the theoretical standpoint, we could also say, well, just like as in the first example, we still think there's constituents, and we can look for these constituents. In fact, we have a better evidence of constituents here, because went nuts is an idiom in English. It doesn't mean that people actually turned into nuts or went to a place where nuts exist. It's an idiom that means go crazy. They lost themselves in emotion, right? And what that means is that this unit, this group of words, means something specific. And so we can say that there is definitely words grouped together to mean things here. And so that adds to our evidence that constituency works. And then we get to the last one. This one is written in phonetic, really broad phonetics. It says, I talked for hours. And here I wrote it in IPA so that we wouldn't be tempted to make observations based on our orthography. So just as we could make some observations. For example, words are psychological. They're not necessarily real. They're there. We would, as an English speaker, we could be able to tell where the words are, but they're not inherent. They're part of our psychology, not necessarily part of a reality outside of language. We can also talk about sounds and how each word combines to form very complex pronunciations. From the theoretical perspective, we could say, continue with our assumption about constituency and say that, yes, instead of talking about words, what we're talking about is meaningful sound units that are grouped together. So for hours, that sound section is a constituent, is something that is grouped together for meaning. So we've looked at them both empirically and theoretically. Here's another example from a different language. This is a language called Xincan. It is spoken in southeastern Guatemala. There's currently one speaker, but all the information that I present here comes from past documentation and work with this language. Now, if we look at this word, as we look at these examples, we need to understand interlinear glossing a little bit. Every time linguistic data, especially syntactic linguistic data, is presented, it's presented in an interlinear gloss. And usually that entails 3 lines. On the very first line is what we call the source line, and that's the actual language. And it might be in phonetic transcription or in orthography. And it's usually written in italics. Here also, each morpheme will be separated from every other morpheme in the word. So, for example, in the very first word, shukai, it's clear that there is one word shuka and another morpheme e that is important, and that's separated by the hyphen. In the second line, we have to give glosses or meanings for each of the morphemes we identified. So shuka means eat, and this y, this glottalized y, means third person singular for transitive verbs. Okay. Tenua means sapote, na means the, and hurak means man. So we get the man eat the sapote. The same, and so this is how most data will be represented. Once we have this information, often data will be presented without morphological breaks, as in the next example, nahurak shukai tenua, and all that will be represented here will be what is different, and the only thing that's different here is the gloss. So that's all that's actually added here. So if we were to look at these from an empirical standpoint, we would come to some observations. We could say something like, wow, Shinken has glottalized consonants. They have a verb, object, subject, word order. They have articles. We could say something like, this word order is variable because it's also subject, verb, object. But that with variable word order comes considerable differences in pragmatic force. Okay, and we can generalize from that. So we could say, based on our English from the last slide and Shinken from this slide, we could say something like languages must either be SOV or VOS, and changes may be pragmatically motivated or something like that. And that would be the empirical way of looking at language. The theoretical one, we're going to keep pursuing this assumption that languages have constituents. And we could say the same thing. So if there are constituents in this language, which is our hypothesis, we want to test that here. And we want to see if any words, any groups of words, act as a unit. And it turns out that we can move nahurak around as if it was one unit, right? Despite its pragmatic differences. And this supports the idea of constituency and helps us refine the model that we are trying to construct of language. Here's another example from a different language, Wichi. This language is spoken in Argentina. This particular variety of Wichi comes from a place called sorry about that. It comes from Misión La Paz, which is spoken just across the border from Paraguay on the Pilcomayo River. So if we look at this, we look at the gloss line and then the source line and then the gloss line and then the translation line, we notice some very interesting things compared to the other examples that we've seen. So let's look at this empirically first. We see that Ouha Weya, which means I dress you, is all one word. Okay, and it translates as a single sentence into English. Its closest translation is a single sentence. The same thing for the next sentence. Owu nashkonteya. I counted my money. Again, it's only one word. And so we can say something empirically about this. We can make observations that many of the syntactic things that we deal with in English are morphemes in other languages. We can say that this language can do lots of things with a single word that English requires multiple sentences to do, or multiple words to do. Now, theoretically, we're going to keep testing this constituency assumption. So our test is if there is constituency. Now, in this kind of sentence, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to talk about constituency because there's only a single word. And even though it translates as a complete sentence in another language, it doesn't really function like a sentence in Wichi. So for these data, for example, we could say, well, in some languages, constituency must not exist. Of course, this is not the right conclusion. And if we had the whole data set, we would be able to come to a better conclusion about constituency. But for now, we would have to say that we have to refine our model that says some languages have constituents and some languages don't. Where constituency is an important part of our model for some languages, but not for others. And so we need to look for an abstract way of representing this choice between constituency or not constituency. Here's an even more important example, or more pertinent example. This is from Gerbil, which is a fantastic language syntactically. Lots of really cool things go on in this language. The gloss and the source line are kind of wonky, but the way it works is it says the first word is that, and then the second word is woman, and then the third word is that, and then man, and then see. And it means the man saw the woman. And what we can do is we can rearrange all of these words into any order. Okay? Even what we might think as being part of a constituent can be rearranged in any order. So the next 5 sentences are all have the same meaning. The man saw the woman. And you'll notice that there's a number of different changes in word order and for all the words involved. The last sentence there is the woman saw the man. Now, we can mark the agent, the person doing the verb, by the ergative marker, which is the suffix n for. There's actually 2 ergative suffixes, but ngu, velar nasal gu, is the ergative marker, and that marks the subject. And so anything that's marked that way, we understand as the subject in this sentence. But it doesn't really matter where it occurs, as long as it's marked morphologically. Okay, so these are some observations we can make. We can even make predictions that some languages have constituency, some languages don't, and we can say that even grammatical functions are not universal for all languages, and that we need to come up with some other assumption about language to explain why some are very word order oriented and others are not. From the theoretical perspective, testing our constituency structure, we'll notice that things like balandugumbil, which would be that woman, we would expect that to be a constituent. But if we look at some of these examples, we notice that it doesn't always work together. Or we get stuff separated that we would thought were going to be constituents. And so the question is, if these are constituents, how do we solve these word order problems? And which one of these are acting as units, and which one of these are not acting as units? And so again, our question about constituency is even more tested by this data. And so we need to come back and find a new way to model our ideas about language. So, without a purpose, our analysis will become shallow. That means when we are doing linguistic analysis and we're looking for structure, we have to have a reason for looking for this structure. Just to say language has structure is pretty uninteresting. Some of the purposes that linguists have identified over the years are included in this list. There's a lot of them, and what your interests will be varied according to what interests you. But these are some of them, and we always need to keep this in mind. Right? We are studying the structures of languages. We are comparing them between themselves to answer these purposes. Now, there's a number level of adequacies that are required in studying structure. Observational adequacy, is it observationally true what we're talking about? Descriptive, does our descriptions count for the data? Are our analysis, the descriptions of the data adequate enough? Do our analyses actually explain all the facts of the data? Psychological adequacy, do our analysis adequately address psychological issues or psycholinguistic issues? Do our analysis address all the pragmatic forces involved? Do our analyses address all the typological factors involved? These are all important parts of methodologies when we're studying the structure of languages.